Tales are or who they are. And so I pulled together a little fact sheet for you to center you. The most famous Jack tale is Jack and the Beanstalk. And the easiest way to put the history of Jack is that so many people in the Appalachian Mountains, came from European countries. And we hear all too often how our forefathers came with only the shirts on their back, and they were lucky to have a feather mattress, and they probably had that on their back too. And not everybody could ride a horse into the Appalachian Mountains as they immigrated to the Appalachian Mountains. However, the stories are the stories they brought in their minds. People who are probably between the ages of 45 and 65 still have an essence, or older than 45, have an essence within them of remembering when people actually told stories by memory, a type of oral history, if you will, because certainly if your parents told you Cinderella, then naturally they would be telling it from memory. Generally, as the old folk tales and fairy tales, people were not necessarily telling their children from a book. So therefore, it was easy when the people came to America that they had this heritage behind them where they had parents who had told them things. Some of the families were lucky enough when they came to America that they intermarried with families that were talkers so that they could have the stories split back and forth. My mother said, she lived to be 89 years old, and she said that in the early 20s, there were still families that had talkers. And generally, it was sort of an understood type of heritage that at least one person in the family was going to be able to recall Aunt Maud and Uncle Sue, and the time was when we went to the family reunion, and we'd talk about it. And so my mother instilled in me that we had come from a long line of talkers. And I'm a talker. And I think that it is instilled in certain people, in certain families. And therefore, Ray Hicks became known as the last living traditional JackTale teller in North America. And the only other living JackTale teller, he passed away 4 years ago, and the only other living JackTale teller is Duncan Williamson, who lives in Fife, Scotland. So Duncan Williamson, of course, helped us trace the fact that the early JackTales were very definitely Scottish. The early JackTales were very definitely Scottish, and the early JackTales, therefore, were Irish, English, and if you really want to get a knockdown, drag out, there are some German stories that also have Irish origins. And so if I come to a group like this and there are a bunch of Irish scholars there, we get in an argument over which stories that I say are German origin because of the Harmon influence in the Beech Mountain families, and we haven't been able to trace any Irish. And so therefore, there's a story that's really German origin that if I read you the story, you'd say, oh, I know that's a German story. But then again, if you are an Irish scholar, there is a plot and structure exactly like the German story. So it's always in history, heritage, storytelling, myth, and fairy tales, folklore, any way you want to cut it, there's always what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing. Because we can only say what we think or what we know from studying families, but yet we can't say what's for real because we weren't here in the 1700s. But the one thing we do know for sure is that the first JackTale that was written, that was remembered, was in 1708. We also know that Jack is always someone that uses his wit. It's most often the fact that the JackTale person, image, human, reference, icon, hero, however, is a trickster. And so the Jack of the English folklore that climbed the beanstalk is a Nazi the spider. So if you studied any West African stories, you have the same character. And in West Africa, he could also be a spider who was literally a spider, or sometimes they say he was a spider-like man, depending on, I guess, which tribe was telling the story. So there's a mystery within the trickster stories because in Nigeria, the trickster is a rabbit. And we know that the trickster rabbit came to America when Joel Chandler Harris told about Brer Rabbit. So Jack is also Brer Rabbit. The only thing that is so important that we all know about the JackTales is they are possibly the first folklore to be brought to this country that has been perpetuated since the middle 1700s. And it's called folklore, not fake lore. Because fake lore becomes someone like Pecos Bill, John Henry, Paul Bunyan. Those are considered fake lore, but they are representative characters of the middle hard-working man. I was going to say middle income, but in the 1800s we weren't thinking middle income. But he's the hard-working man. So like John Henry has become so much folklore because he was integrated into poetry and song. Integrated into poetry and song. And being integrated into poetry and song made him a standout, especially in the early 1900s, like in the 1917s, 1920, when a lot of the news was put into poetry and song. And so he became so important because he was the first issue where the human being was against mechanization. So John Henry actually went into a competition with a mechanized hammer to prove, right? So it was a made-up kind of thing that a journalist came up with. Pecos Bill is the same thing. Paul Bunyan is the same thing. So the interesting thing is within our folk heritage, American folk heritage, these characters have outstripped Jack. Most people, if I say, okay, Pecos Bill, they go, oh yeah. If I say John Henry, the steel driving man, oh yeah, I studied him. And we study these characters that are considered fake lore, even though they are not representative of our area. So if you're living in California, when I say our area, Paul Bunyan is not representative of California, but you know who Paul Bunyan is. The same thing with Pecos Bill. If you're living in Texas, every school kid basically studies Pecos Bill. But even though Jack is the first American hero brought to this country, and there are hundreds of JackTales, he's not known. We can't say Jack and they'll go, who? Even though everybody knows Jack and the Beanstalk, that you have to explain it. So that kind of gives you a background. The interesting thing about the character Jack is that Jack is an Irish, Scottish, English name. It's an easy name for the people who came from England, Scotland, Ireland to understand. So even though they may have intermarried into German families whose names might have been Cutliff, Jack still came out on top. So we don't have Cutliff stories, we do have JackTales or Jack stories. And also what happened within the embodiment of the JackTales is that we had no television, no electricity, no roads, no cars, none of the conveniences that we have today, no running water, no indoor plumbing. So when the mountain people had nothing but the stories to entertain themselves and their children. The interesting thing about JackTales and Jack stories is that the plots are very similar to the European plots, but they're also intertwined with biblical stories. So there are certain Jack's tales that immediately bring to mind that you would say, oh, that's a biblical plot. That's nothing but the Bible. That's an eye for an eye. Or you would say, oh, that's nothing but the prodigal son. But we're telling the prodigal son, and we're telling it with Jack and his father. And his brothers are always Will and Tom. So I got involved with doing Jack stories or JackTales because I used to direct a children's theater. And I decided that I was going to do American heritage, and nothing would be better than me living in North Carolina, and we're the bastion of North Carolina stories. Because the Hicks, Harmon, and Ward families of Old Beach Mountain are basically certified by the Smithsonian and also by the Library of Congress that they are the families who saved the JackTales. So that it came down through this family in an unbroken line of descendancy since about 1770. So a lot of people will say, oh, you're talking about Grimm's fairy tales. So that's why I put in here, and I want to stand corrected here, that these are the oldest known folk tales in America. They were told before Jacob and Wilhelm were born in 1785 and 1786, the brothers Grimm. were born. So these stories were told in Appalachia for, at the same time, 10 years, 15 years before the Grimm brothers were even born. But if you read the Grimm stories and you study them, Jack is mentioned very often because Jack and the Beanstalk is there, after all. And then there are a lot of plots about a young boy besting giants. Also, the early JackTales were very brutal because somebody's head was being cut off all the time. And if you study the Bible, so were a lot of heads cut off in the Bible. If you study modern times and you're looking at Iraq and Iran, they're cutting off a lot of heads still, even in our time. We're just not doing it in the United States, nor do we want to think about it or face it. So as the stories have been handed down, the rough language has been cut out because we no longer have Hardy Hard Ass. He's suddenly Hardy Hard Head, because we don't want to go around telling our students, nor do we want to tell anyone's children Hardy Hard Ass. But in the mountains, as Ray Hicks said, before religion came in and took hold of the people's minds, it was nothing to tell the children Hardy Hard Ass. But when his grandparents got religion, it suddenly became that they were telling lies. So never mind that his family had been telling JackTales, singing crazy songs like the groundhog song, like we're going to eat the groundhog and the grease is running out of our mouths type of song, and Sally's coming off the mountain toting the molasses kind of, that's giving us a bird's eye view of actually what's happening historically in those communities. But the grandparents started frowning on it because the ministers told them, you can't say words like that. You cannot say what we would call straight out profanity. And if that is filming me, I don't want to be repeating any of that on the videotape. But that used to be very loose lips. And it was okay because young'uns heard everything. And then it had to be cleaned up. So Ray said that one time, he said the donkey had to sit his hind end down. And he said, Lynn, I was very careful that when I was talking to those elementary school children that I said hind end. And he said, when I was a child, my granddaddy would have said the donkey sat his ass down. And so he said, after I was so careful that one of the school teachers came up afterwards and said, Ray, you're telling it a little rough, ain't you? You don't ever know. Different strokes for different folks. So I will go into some more JackTales type of material. Do you have a question? Do you sort of know who the JackTales are?
Do I understand you correctly that fake lore is, those are tales created by
journalists generally?
Journalists.
Right. In other words, basically my estimation of what I did some advanced storytelling studies at East Tennessee State University has a master's degree in storytelling. And so before I got a master's degree in something else, I started off in that master's degree, and it became very difficult for me to commute through the mountains to go to East Tennessee State University. And I became much more interested in writing than just researching stories. But I did do a great deal of work toward a master's in storytelling. And so that's basically one of the things I learned when I paid, I don't know how many thousands of dollars just for that one little tidbit, but technically speaking, it was discovered that Pecos Bill, Paul Bunyan, and John Henry were short stories made up by a journalist or essayist. And of course, it caught the fancy of the reading public in the 1800s. And John Henry especially because of the railroads opening the West in the mid-1800s. So people fell in love with John Henry because it was germane to what was actually happening in American culture. The other thing you have to understand that Jack became the name of the character because children were more likely, if they were entertained by a story, an oral telling, to say, Daddy, tell us another story about Jack. And so that is prevalent today, that if you were to go to tell John Henry stories that entertained your children or your grandchildren, they would come back and they say, do you have another story about John Henry? And then you would be thinking, and you may actually come up with a story that's Cinderella and call it John Henry meets her fella, whatever, but it would be the same thing. Look at J.K. Rowling, the most, I guess she has changed the face of writing for popular fiction forever. and has made a benchmark that will be impossible probably for anyone else to ever overcome. And if you think about what Harry Potter is, Harry Potter begins with Cinderella. It's Cinderella just straight out. And it's just another example for your classes and for your imagination that when you're looking at these old stories and these old repetitions of stories, that there's really nothing new. But it can wear a new dress, it can wear a new hairdo, and it can become male. Hey, and then what the American public doesn't realize is that the German Cinderella is a male who had an ugly stepfather. There's a version of Cinderella in Germany that is like the French Cinderella, but it's a man. So who knows? She might have said, "Oh, what a great idea! I've come across this German Cinderella kind of thing, and I will turn it into something more modern."